The disallowance and reservation of federal legislation. It is a curious anomaly of the Canadian Constitution that the imperial powers of reservation and disallowance still exist in legal form. Neither have ever been repealed or amended. Had these powers been used as widely as were those in relation to provincial legislation, the imperial imprint would have been felt very firmly in Canada. However, both powers were first greatly restricted and then neutered by convention. Only one Canadian Act, the Oaths Act of 1873, was disallowed by the British government, and the last time the Governor-General exercised the power of reservation was in 1886. These powers subsequently fell into desuetude and firm conventions have developed against their use. Even before these powers were nullified, however, their practical exercise was greatly restricted. As Cassault J of the Quebec Superior Court said in 1879, Ce déshabillé ne peut être prononcé par la reine que lorsqu'une loi sanctionnée par le gouverneur-général empiète sur les prérogatives du souverain ou du parlement impérial. 5. The reservation of dominion legislation on the initiative of the Governor-General was nullified by a convention agreed to at the First Colonial Conference convened by Britain in 1887. 6. By the time of the 1926 Imperial Conference, opinion had clearly solidified against an exercise of reservation or disallowance, and a qualified statement was made to that effect. The report of the 1929 conference stated quite plainly, the conference agree that the present constitutional position is that the power of disallowance can no longer be exercised in relation to dominion legislation. With regard to reservation, the report stated that the British government's advice to the King would never be against the views of the government of the Dominion concerned. Thus a Governor-General's reservation would be totally ineffective. With the adoption of these resolutions by the full Imperial Conference in 1930, the powers of disallowance and reservation of dominion legislation can be said to have been totally nullified by convention. The Imperial Conferences of 1929 and 1930 also led to the repeal by the 1931 Statute of Westminster of the provisions of the Colonial Courts of Admiralty Act, 1890 and the Merchant Shipping Act, 1894, which had required the reservation, for British government approval, of dominion legislation on related topics. 7. If the powers of reservation and disallowance of federal legislation were ever to be considered by a court, it is not entirely clear what its verdict would be. Certainly in 1938, these powers relating to federal legislation were said to be subsisting and unfettered in law by a majority of the Supreme Court, in answer to reference questions about the reservation and disallowance of provincial statutes. 8. As Canon J declared, the Imperial Conferences could not and did not change the law. 9. However, several developments since then have occurred which might lead to a different conclusion. The Canadian Governor-General continued at the time to forward copies of all federal legislation to the British government, in fulfillment of his obligations under S. 56 of the 1867 Constitution Act and the Letters Patent of 1931. However, this practice stopped in 1942. 10. In 1947, the new Letters Patent which were issued constituting the office of Governor-General omitted a provision, found in all previous Letters Patent, which mentioned the requirement to forward legislation. That same year, the federal parliament repealed a Canadian statute of 1925-11, which also provided for the forwarding of legislation to Britain. Since the power of disallowance may only be exercised after the receipt by the British Minister of the Canadian legislation, the practice of not forwarding legislation has effectively neutered the power of disallowance. However, the actual powers of disallowance or refusing assent to a reserved bill might also be declared by the courts to be spent even in law, because of the inability of the British government to advise the Queen on Canadian matters. This inability grew, as we shall see later, purely out of political practice, but it would be a most regrettable display of formalist legal theory if Canadian judges were to hold that even in the full flower of Canadian independence British ministers still retain these rights in law.